Have you ever wondered why during the craziest, most unbelievable dream experiences, it rarely crosses your mind just how peculiar what you're experiencing is? Why doesn't it feel weird when it's happening? Why don't you question it? Now, these types of experiences are brought to you by the sponsor of today's video, your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. What emerges from this area of our brain and any related metacognitive functioning involved in things like memory, emotions, sensory input, and more is the construction of our own internal model of reality. Now, these reality testing circuits are responsible for ensuring that anything we experience is not only internally consistent, but also consistent with our model of reality that we've constructed. Now, when we experience something that challenges our concept of reality, we experience what's known as cognitive dissonance. And at this point, the aforementioned parts of your brain take control and use various strategies like rationalizing or engaging in motivated reasoning in order to satisfy those concerns. If you're unable to recognize this internal inconsistency, we're motivated to do something to remedy this. Now, this cognitive dissonance is often the key, the trigger to having one's opinions or beliefs change. But this is also, of course, what happens when our brain functions are operating at levels we'd consider normal, absent things like brain damage or when you're asleep. Now, in either case, this can result in the related functions of our brains hypofunctioning or operating at decreased or insufficient levels, or potentially even turned off completely. Now, this explains how and why we can have all sorts of crazy, unbelievable shit happen to us while we're dreaming, and at no point question the experience. The reality testing mechanisms in your brain are simply switched off. If I was a grad student right now studying psychology or neurology, I'd probably be dedicating my thesis research right now to investigating the link between dream states, the conscious and subconscious mind, and their connection to the suspension of disbelief, reality testing, and the experiences of being fully immersed while awake in things like movies, books, and video games. If you find yourself enjoying some experience you're having, whether it's a lucid dream state or whether you're immersed in some imaginary fictional world, you'll know what I mean when I say how frustrating and disappointing it can be when you're forcefully removed from it, with the ability to control experiencing it again in the same way, often completely gone. These experiences, escaping our normal life and immersing ourselves in something different, something powerful, something fun, something emotional, something we enjoy, is why most of us play video games. Like a dream, this escape doesn't have to make sense to someone outside of it for the experience to be enjoyable. It doesn't have to be realistic in the sense that it follows the normal laws of physics or human interaction. These experiences run on coherence. They're powered and sustained by the strength of their internal consistency. As long as what happens makes sense in the context of the world you're in, there's no need to question it, you simply experience it. As soon as something happens that's suddenly at odds with this internal consistency, you could call it a glitch in the matrix, that's when the simulation starts to break down. The metaphorical partitions between the different layers of reality that we're experiencing suddenly become visible. It's nearly impossible to ignore. You find yourself awake. Now, the first installment of the Getting Tarkov series discussed the idea that Tarkov doesn't need to be fun, explaining the intended experience of the game as I understand it. Now, unfortunately, as is commonly the case, too many people read the title or the thumbnail, ignore most of the content or context of the video, and misunderstand the entire message. And it's no coincidence that these tend to be the same folks that also complain that my videos are too long, that I talk too much about unrelated shit, or that I should get to the point much faster. I might not be the most succinct, but what I try to be is thorough. Everything I say in these videos is purposeful. It's there to add context, to add perspective. It's there to do what most of my favorite and influential content did for me: pique my interest and get me to think differently, explore and research other topics and ideas outside whatever box I was living in. Now, it seems as though the conclusion that many of these folks have come to is that any frustration experienced during the game, any anger or disappointment felt, is the intended design. It's an indicator of the game's success. Anytime someone's upset by the game, no matter what the reason is, this is instantly seen as a good thing. It's as if they think that getting Tarkoved equals frustration and getting Tarkoved is the goal. Now, the seed that I've been trying to plant in the grassroots of the Tarkov community is that there are important and subtle differences between the reasons for being upset while playing the game, the types of frustration felt. Some are intended by the developers and others aren't. The distinction between being upset at the game and being upset while playing the game is a subtle one, but is, in my opinion, a really important one that the community should consider. So many folks in the community seem so sure of where the game is going, what makes the game good, what makes Tarkov, Tarkov, but I'm here to say that I honestly think that so many of them have missed the mark. They don't quite have a real understanding of what aspects contribute to the good parts of Tarkov and what aspects lead to the bad. They recognize that Tarkov is special, but don't truly understand why. They've come to the right conclusion, but I think for the wrong reasons, and they don't realize that the more they apply their reasoning, the further they'd actually be getting from what they really want in the end. The more we as a community are able to recognize and understand the idiosyncrasies of game design in general and how they apply to Tarkov today and what it can be in the future, the more likely we are to help steer this ship in the right direction. Let's explore what makes this game so special, what marks the Tarkov experience, what gives it the heart and soul we all love, whether on the winning or losing end of a fight. And then let's shed light on what aspects are antithetical to this idea, whether we realize it or not. This is Getting Tarkoved. Let's begin this discussion by looking at one of the least contentious topics in the Tarkov community, the unbelievable amount of effort that's been put into modeling the environments, the firearms, their attachments, and the sounds and animations that accompany them. The tone, the feeling, the atmosphere, especially for players brand new to this experience, is unmatched. This is where Tarkov shines, where the magic is for many. Now, the essence of this is what we'll be discussing in our first topic, which I'll refer to as environmental immersion. Environmental immersion is the experience provided to players through the ambiance of the world their characters inhabit. When it comes to immersion, the idea that the more the better is not necessarily a good one. Now, I don't need to say anything other than to toss this on screen to make my point here clear.
Okay, Black Spirit, you need to calm the fuck down. It can't be every time I kill something, 8 new things appear on my screen. Simplify UI. Oh, got it. Well, let me check it. It's the only non-usable thing. God, no. God. This...
What we should be aiming for if we're designing an experience, or hoping for if we're playing in one, is a richness of that experience. The goal is quality over quantity. Now, the amount and completeness of the sensory information we're provided is also important. Now, for anybody who's been around my Twitch stream when I go live, the very first raid of every stream I do is what's come to be called an immersion run. I turn off my face cam, I mute my microphone, I take it slow, I try my best to play the part, really immerse myself in the audience in the experience. I try to play more methodical, or tactical, or intelligently, rather than holding W and running and gunning like crazy, which I admit I do like to do every now and then. Now, something I've learned through this fun little stream intro bit that I do is that the immersion process goes both ways. As the player, it's also our job to pay attention to the details, the subtleties, to use our imagination. There's an endless amount of details and interactions that you may never have noticed or taken the time to appreciate. The way that the raindrops interact with your eyewear and on the surface of your rifle, the flash of lightning seen shortly before the associated clap of thunder, the stitches and natural-looking wear on my gloves, how the material bunches up and stretches as your hand moves in the various animations, how the corner tips of the cuffs of your jacket bend slightly outward, as if that's what you grabbed onto when you pulled your sleeves up, the worn, rusty parts of the diamond-plated flooring, the way your teammates' heads move as they free look around the environment, the glow of the various bits of electrical and chemical lighting all over the place and how they reflect off of and tint the nearby surfaces differently depending on their material, the warning and safety signs posted on the walls surrounding tables filled with tools and medical testing equipment, stacks of boxes sitting on pallet jacks, loading bays with forklifts sitting between rows of metal shelving, every bit fully selling that this was once a living, breathing, fully functional test lab. A quite nice and relaxing Russian breeze swaying the trees and filled with birds chirping as they fly through the air. The way that your character actually engages buttons and switches as you fiddle around with your gun and your gear. The sounds of your footsteps change as you walk at different speeds and transition from grass to dirt to gravel and back again. The way certain types of trash is thrown around the environment, both seemingly randomly but at the same time feels real. It gives the environment life. It tells a story. Whenever I walk by this rock, for some reason I picture a group of edgy high school scavs that snuck out at night in their black hoodies to hang out by the rock, drinking some beers and smoking cigarettes that they stole from their parents. You can actually take the in-game maps into raids with you if you want, marking down your own points of interest, loot spots, etc., and how with the addition of the compass, using the in-game maps is actually far more useful than it used to be for new players wanting to explore without having to have a browser window open on another computer. The hum of the fluorescent lighting overhead, the graffiti all over the walls, and piles of trash thrown into corners, sitting under mildew-covered ceilings.
What?
Now, if you check a magazine that has a window on it, you get a more precise ammo count than if it didn't have a window on it. All these details carry through to all the maps, so much that you'd actually think that some of them were literally inspired by real-life locations, though. Now, perhaps we're a bit spoiled with all of this insane attention to detail. It's kind of a double-edged sword in a way. I've come to expect a certain minimum threshold of detail that's probably admittedly a little bit too ambitious and nitpicky to be upset about, but still worth mentioning, if only to be noted and considered during the final bits of development right before the game is released. Things like there being no interaction between weather effects and things like campfires, scattered debris that appears to be hovering just slightly above the floor, your character being unaffected by a barrage of hot brass being violently ejected out of your teammate's gun directly into your face, the way that the AI reacts, or in this case doesn't, to their friends' heads being blown off inches from their face, or how they'll throw a grenade while being shot at and then instantly sprint towards the grenade they just threw, somehow managing to kill you anyway. The lack of a mounting feature coupled with the awkwardness of jumping. Fucking shitty game. The lack of any consideration of the context of a situation when using the voice lines.
You sick. Down.
All the bugs and inconsistencies with animations like prone leaning and aiming, and pretty much anything having to do with sound. So, all these things that he just mentioned, all this attention to detail, isn't that just another way of saying realistic? I thought he said realism didn't matter. Well, I did, and here's where I can begin to solidify that distinction. One of the most common themes as of late when I'm streaming is for me to be a bit frustrated with particular mechanics of the game for various reasons. Let's say for the sake of example, I'm complaining about stamina being drained when you are shot. That's usually when, as if on cue, a band of folks enter the chat and start spamming "stop complaining, that's realism." This perspective not only assumes one particular kind of realism, a kind of realism that at its core is simply punishing and painful, but assumes that that is the goal of Tarkov, a good thing for the game no matter what. So then, let's do what's nearly impossible to do live during a stream with Twitch chat, fairly and honestly consider various aspects of the game through the lens of these two questions. 1, are they realistic? And 2, is realism always good for the game? Whoa! Now let's start with the second question first, as I think it's a little bit easier to answer. Take a look at this diagram. This is the sort of thing that many have been picturing in their heads when they're on the topic of what makes games like Tarkov good. Look at all these other games. They have more lenient mechanics, less detailed health or ballistic systems, no survival mechanics. They've got mini-maps and radars and teammate indicators, kill streaks and stylized or cartoony graphics, and the list goes on. These are all aspects of unrealism, aspects that many people don't enjoy. Now, Tarkov has more realistic versions of these features and doesn't include lots of unrealistic fluff. This lack of arcadey elements is the key, right? Well, if you go to any Tarkov Twitch chat, Reddit thread, or YouTube video comment section, you'll undoubtedly find somebody arguing over which aspects are realistic, which aren't, how good or bad certain aspects of the game are, and more. Many folks assume that the extent to which people enjoy Tarkov is proportional to how hardcore they are, like some sort of digital dick measuring contest. If you don't like it, find a new game. Tarkov is punishing, and it's meant to be. Don't try and change it or improve it. You're only softening the experience, moving it this way along the spectrum, watering it down, and making it worse like every other game out there. Now, this idea that realism is always good is begging to be hit with the reductio ad absurdum, or the reduction to absurdity argument. This form of logical argument can be employed to demonstrate that an idea is most likely false by showing that when the idea is applied fully, following it to its logical conclusion, that you end up in a ridiculous or impossible state. If you claim that realism is good, the most effective and compelling way to demonstrate the flaw in that claim is to present you with an example that we can both agree is realistic, but that you also have to concede would obviously not be good for the game. How about we add a tripping mechanic to the game? At random moments, depending on your terrain, your gear, your experience, your character will trip, causing you to fall over, immobilized, maybe even injured, dropping your gun on the ground. I don't think anybody would argue that this is realistic. People trip all the time in real life. But is it good for the game? Shall we add mechanics that introduce durability on the soles of your boots, or require that you play a tie up your combat boots minigame before every raid to limit the chances of spraining your ankle while in combat? Hey bro, did you see the latest patch notes? I'm really stoked. I've been hoarding all this toothpaste. Apparently they added gingivitis to the game. Make sure you brush your teeth after you munch down that Tushonka, or you're going to end up getting a huge debuff to your charisma skill. Pestily even said in his latest quest guide video that if you have bad breath, it blocks access to both of the new romance quest lines. Honestly, I've been dying to fix this love triangle that I've got between Ragman and Therapist so I can finally get my prescription on my Ray benches updated. This fucking astigmatism's killing me. Imagine when you purchase your Tarkov account that randomly to 1.3% of the player base, their PMCs are diagnosed with Crohn's, an inflammatory bowel disease that'll affect your PMC's digestive tract, adding a huge penalty to endurance, stamina, health, immunity, metabolism, vitality, and stress resistance. Unfortunately for those players, their firefights are going to be interrupted constantly by uncontrollable diarrhea, and there's nothing really they can do about it. That's realism, bro.
What the fuck? Oh man.
Some folks even go so far as to claim to unironically enjoy how shitty the user experience is between raids, saying that that is a part of the hardcore punishing experience. You should really feel bad about that death. Bro, my friend's uncle is in the Marines. He talks about them building guns every time they respawn all the time. It's legit so fucking hardcore, dude. Alright, you want hardcore punishing? Let's lean into it, boys and girls. Every time you die, your Tarkov client finds your System32 folder and deletes it. You're really going to be valuing your survival and playing carefully if every death requires a full operating system reinstall. Now, of course, I could go on all day with more absurd examples of realism that most sane folks would agree are silly, and I guess if you haven't gotten the point now, you're probably not going to. Now, I know this doesn't satisfy the types of people who want a one-size-fits-all answer for all their problems, but this problem clearly requires more nuance to properly answer. Let's now move on to the first question we asked ourselves before: of all the various aspects of the game, which are realistic? To what extent, and in what ways? What is realism anyway? Now, the unfortunate truth of the matter, and this is something that extends far outside of the context of video games, is that too many people have a drastically oversimplified process of evaluating what's true or realistic. No actual thought goes into questions that are asked. Everyone already has all the answers already, which would be great if the conclusions that they came to were the result of critical thinking and honest consideration. Instead, everything we already know was told to us by our favorite streamer or Reddit, your favorite news outlet, or your parents or your best friends. We all just hear it and take it for granted and move on. When talking about realism, we're ultimately trying to answer questions about what would happen, how things work, what would someone do, how would they react in different situations, all in the context of real life. How do bullets travel through the air when shot? How far could you run with 50 kilograms of gear on your back? Would a helmet actually protect your head if it was shot? Would a real soldier ever run out in the open like this? If you were shot in the shoulder while you were running, could you keep running? Would you be able to control a gun firing full auto like this? How about this gun? What about this one? Now, while these are all admittedly interesting questions to consider, it's abundantly clear that there's no single answer to any of them. For every story you hear about an incredible sniper one-shot kill, someone else has one of the time their buddy's helmet bounced a sniper round. For every veteran who tells you about the misery and horrors of Bastogne or what their time in the Korengal Valley was really like, you have others who'll tell you the majority of their military experience could be summed up by long stretches of sheer and utter boredom. For every story you hear about a law enforcement officer bringing down a threat with a single well-placed 9mm round, you hear another who survived being shot more than a dozen times, unfazed. All this is to say that looking at some result, some experience in a game and concluding that it was realistic or not doesn't really bring any value to the discussion, but what it does do is distract from the deeper conversation. When examining some video game experience after the fact, it's far more fruitful to be asking what happened, why did it happen, and if it was intended or not. These questions bring us all the way back full circle to my previous videos in this series. How can we actually know what happened? Is the data that we have reliable? And even if we know what happened and can trust the data, how can we know that the result is the desired one? Given the complexity and chaos of the systems and the lack of visibility into the underlying design and goals, there's really no way to examine and judge what it is that we see. Anyone who starts with the conclusion that whatever happens in the game is intentional suffers from being able to justify literally anything. There's probably some real-world justification for what happened, and if there isn't anything you can think of to defend it from that perspective, then the fact that it caused the player some sort of frustration or suffering is justification itself. This type of mindset is some fundamentalist bullshit, and honestly, y'all need to just kick the Kool-Aid. Now conversely, anybody who starts with the conclusion that all frustration, all suffering is someone else's fault, it had to have been desync, it had to have been a cheater, it had to have been a stream sniper, it must have been a bug. There's no way that person could have done what they did, known what they knew, reacted however quickly they were able to. They played me like they were 2 steps ahead of me that entire time. There's no way. These types of people are just as bad as the first group. The truth of the matter is that we've probably all swung a little too much in both directions at different times throughout our EFT careers. This includes streamers, normal community members, all the rats and chads in the comment sections, the developers, everybody. So shaming or demonizing somebody when it happens every now and then is pointless because all you've done is put a rod on your own back. We should all do our best to recognize the tendency and try our best to take an honest look at what happened and discuss the what, how, and why after we've let the emotional dust settle a bit. Every one of us is an incoherent, bumbling idiot when we're salty. Except me, I'm never salty. The problem with the mentality that this is realistic or this isn't realistic is that even for people who do know about many of these things from their real-life personal experiences, many of them don't even necessarily agree on tons of the details, and lots of them have different and often contrasting anecdotes. Now, obviously, this is simply the nature of the human experience. There's rarely a single, simple right answer as to what is real and what isn't. Now, what matters when we want to talk about realism in the context of video games are not specific real-world situations, results, or anecdotes, but rather the essence of it, the heart and soul of the game. So with all this in mind, I hope you're now beginning to see how measuring or comparing different games along some sort of spectrum like this isn't nearly as insightful as you might think. This problem arises from the fallacy that's at the core of this entire endeavor. The idea that realism is not only easily quantifiable, but is also the principal metric for which games and their mechanics should be compared. What this model is effectively requiring is that we take ourselves in the real world, gamers sitting in our pajamas with our keyboard and mice, and place us in these experiences, and the success criteria of the various design elements of the game depend on how realistically we react or feel in these scenarios. Now, what shouldn't surprise me, but still does, is that the nuance of why this is problematic is lost on many, given that the most common rebuttal I hear in response to when I theorycraft or question certain aspects of Tarkov are, do you actually think you could do that? Could you keep running if you got shot? Do you think you could fire a gun with that much accuracy and control? Do you think you could carry that much weight for that long? Now, I'd imagine it doesn't come as a surprise to many of you that yours truly is not a real-life private military contractor. Although it may come as a surprise to know that the question of whether or not I could or would personally do things like that has absolutely no relevance to this discussion because I'm not the character in the universe of the game. What I am is an agent assuming the role of a fictional character, as is the case in role-playing games. There are far more things that set me, the player, apart from my PMC compared to the number of things that we share in common. The extent to which I'm immersed in this experience is the extent to which I feel less like myself and more like the character that I'm given control over. I don't have any formal military training, but my PMC does. I'm not particularly physically fit. I just came back downstairs after taking a piss and sat down in my chair and realized that I had to take a moment to catch my breath before I hit record again. My PMC can presumably handle a bit more physical stress than that. I've never trained for, let alone experienced, a real combat situation. My PMC has. I'm mildly lactose intolerant and quite susceptible to having allergic reactions to dust, mold, and mildew, something that my PMC can hopefully handle a little bit better than myself. My first aid experience is limited to paper towels and band-aids. My PMC presumably has some level of combat first aid training. As of right now, I still really don't understand much of the lore, the history, the story, and the geography, or the politics of Tarkov. My PMC hopefully does. So at this point, I propose that we throw this idea out the window. We can do much better. Let's conceptualize a model that I think is more robust, more practical for discussion and design. Let's start with the first piece of this puzzle, the intended experience, the tone, that feeling, the atmosphere. Now, anybody who's seen the Raid series that BSG has put out has, in my opinion, seen what the intended experience is. I'd be willing to bet that this right here is as close as we'll ever get to being inside Nikita's head, feeling and experiencing exactly what Tarkov is supposed to be. Now, I'm sure there's plenty of aspects of this series that are realistic. I'm sure that there are also tons that aren't, but this is fiction. It's not a recreation of real-life events. It's not a simulation. It's a story that we're meant to experience and enjoy at a number of different levels. Now, on the opposite end of this model is us, the player. Now, we all come from as widely different backgrounds as you can imagine. We're just a set of people with nothing else in common other than we're all booting up the same game on our PCs, and this game has the goal of giving us some sort of unified experience. We are the second piece of the puzzle. Now, the final piece, the most important one in this model, is the one for which the ultimate success of the design should be judged. It's how the video game itself is able to successfully create a seamless interface between the intended experience and the player controlling it. Abstraction is the key concept here. Now, the subtleties of the design of things like the controls, the UI, the environment, the mechanics, all of these things have the primary goal of making players forget that they're using a keyboard and mouse to control a first-person avatar in an early access first-person shooter, and trick us by immersing us into feeling as though we are the PMC. To live vicariously as the PMC is the goal, and this abstraction layer in between is where that happens when it's done successfully. By careful and clever use of design, the aim should be to metaphorically blur the lines between the person sitting at their computer and the role they're taking over within the game, so that in a perfect world, the player's felt experience is the intended experience. That is immersion. That is Tarkov. Abstractions are the key here. Some of the key features in the game, the most important or common interactions that we experience when playing, are also features that are interestingly enough never talked about by the members of the Realism Brigade. These features represent the most abstract and least realistic features, and yet are never criticized by these folks, because in most of these cases, it's actually a lot more clear and obvious why abstraction is needed. We've got quest dialogues that are abstractions for actual conversations between actual people in this world. We've got inventory slots and grids that act as abstractions of vests, backpacks, pockets, and more. We have pretty generic animations that are abstractions for the process of administering medical aid in the midst of combat. We've got health bars and status indicators that act as abstractions for what would otherwise be perceiving agonizing, debilitating physical injuries. We've got features like insurance and post-death healing that are abstractions for, well, literally nothing at all. They're merely there to facilitate the playing of a video game, a fictional hardcore first-person RPG shooter. Tarkov is almost entirely abstractions for what would otherwise be an experience that literally none of us would realistically want to take part in. So please, for the love of God, stop talking about whether or not something is realistic. We need to change the focus on these conversations from trying to achieve realism to whether or not what we're talking about ultimately achieves the desired goal of immersing players in the intended experience. Now, on that note, let me take a brief aside to talk about a game that I took a few days to try out fairly recently, Insurgency Sandstorm. Now, this game has so many elements in common with other first-person shooters that most Tarkov community members would scoff at as being unrealistic or arcadey. But I actually found that they often provided so much more context and utility in an intuitive and natural way, and it created what I would argue felt like a much more realistic and immersive experience that surpassed Tarkov in a ton of different ways.
Fucking hey, look at you. Good kill. Alright, now you see that building right next to the bus?
Now, the graphics might not be as good, the environments aren't as detailed, it doesn't feel as real or alive in the same way, it doesn't have the same sort of tone, but fuck me if this experience wasn't one of the most immersive that I've ever had in a shooter, even though I generally loathed all of the game modes and was in no way interested in winning, however the game defined it at the time. So how is it that Insurgency managed to pull this off, simultaneously having aspects of hardcore realism while also remaining fun, action-packed, accessible, and while being imperfect, manages to maintain an oppressive level of immersion? The answer is that it includes features that create an effective layer of abstraction between the intended experience and the player. Now, of course, there's a ton of mechanics and features that I don't like, would probably want removed or changed, and of course, some of them don't make sense in the context of Tarkov, but you can't deny that there's a ton that we can learn from here and be inspired by. Automatically generated voice lines react and respond to what's happening all the time. The way that the characters automatically react vocally to their injuries is a really unique way to communicate status, rather than having to have icons pop up telling you where you were hit, which benefits both you and anybody close enough to hear you. Now, this also works both ways. Being able to hear nearby enemies is a really cool mechanic as well that gives you context as to who's friendly nearby.
What the fuck is wrong with you? On your knees. I'm going to reload.
Now, unlike Tarkov, your character actually makes a reasonable amount of noise when they move through their environment, with the ability to move faster than a crouched shuffle while also being fairly quiet, allowing you to do something in this game that I feel like I've never been able to do successfully in Tarkov: sneak. Alright, let's watch that last part again. It's subtle, but for some reason there's something really fucking cool about hearing the gun flop on the wood floor after you kill the guy. I love that shit.
No, don't go that way.
All of these incredibly detailed elements of the soundstage provide not only spatial and contextual information, but also add an intense and sometimes even emotional element to the gameplay. It feels much more human, much more real.
I don't know, maybe they've got an IED in there you could use? Just search through the cache and try to find one. And once you arm it, dude, get outside, alright? Stand way back before you blow.
Honestly, there were times where I couldn't tell the difference between the game-generated comms and the in-game VoIP, which is cleverly played both over the player's radios into their headsets, but also proximity-based.
Let's go!
Is that a teammate? Fuck!
Half the team took over this entire objective. Is everyone alright? Who's firing those shots?
Whoa! Jesus!
Hey, you guys just gonna rush off our support here? Is that it?
Don't be stupid, man. Get up! Casualty!
Now, I never felt as though I was fighting against the game when it came to things like movement mechanics or during any of the gunplay. It all just felt fluid and natural. Did I get him?
I need to load!
Now, that visceral, overwhelming feeling this game gives you with all of the explosions and air support and screaming and ricochets going on around you, and even the death animations and graphic representation of injuries is unmatched.
Oh my god.
What a...
What the fuck? You read a little bit?
The guy... Whoa! Bruh!
Sith, I'm over here. Yeah, you're looking at me. Come here. Capturing me!
Move away!
Oh! What the fuck? Where did I get that from, dude? Now, playing this game reminded me how easy it is to forget how exactly we know the things that we know, all of these subtleties that our brains take advantage of without us even realizing it. It's because of this that I'd actually be okay, and now really want, some form of friendly indicator being added to Tarkov, as long as it was done right. What could this feature theoretically look like? Well, that's a much more detailed discussion that maybe I'll save for another video, but right off the top of my head, here are a few quick thoughts. Using Sandstorm as an inspiration for this discussion, both for what we can do and for what things we should avoid. First, I really like the subtle, small colored shape used as an abstract representation of your character's recognition of a person that you're looking at. Now, unlike Sandstorm, I think that these dots should only be visible when the person is within the line of sight of you, preferably as long as some significant portion of them is visible. So if all you see is their boots under a car, perhaps that's not enough to have the friendly indicator be displayed. The end goal should be to provide realistic amounts of both hesitation and ambiguity, and to avoid giving information to players that they realistically wouldn't have. We want to maintain a situation where it's still the player's responsibility to pay attention and make split-second judgment calls, while also not burdening them with the frankly unrealistic and annoying requirement of needing the equivalent of a fucking secret handshake to tell friend from foe. The indicator should act as a tangible representation of your brain's processing. You see a person, your brain takes a moment to do its magic, effectively characterizing them as someone specific that either you recognize or someone you don't. Maybe it appears over their center mass of any PMCs you've partied up with before a raid, and could even dynamically include any randoms that you teamed up with during a raid using the in-game team-up feature. A skill like Perception could affect the delay between seeing the person and the dot appearing, and this could even be affected by all sorts of things like the distance between you, environmental effects like rain or smoke. Hell, even something like the amount of time you've played with that specific person in your lifetime, how long it's been since you saw them last, or another skill like Memory could affect how quickly that dot appears since the last time. Being able to define set colors or even written tags for specific people would be an interesting way of distinguishing between teammates. Now, also keeping in mind accessibility, something that's universally under-prioritized, perhaps colors could be swapped for different shapes, or shapes and colors could be mixed, allowing for interesting customization to be used and giving more context to other folks who might need it, such as those who are colorblind. Now again, you might think that colors and shapes and dots are cartoonish and silly, but what they accomplish is neither of those things, and in many ways far more realistic and balanced than not having them present at all. It's giving your character the affordance of recognizing teammates that you would otherwise recognize. In Tarkov, where everybody has the same face, the same voice, and the same gear, we're not provided that. The ambiguity and confusion of many situations in Tarkov, in my opinion, is actually far less realistic than what you see in something like Sandstorm. Now, if proximity-based VoIP, or voice over IP, otherwise known as proximity chat, was added, just being able to put a location to a voice would be massive for context in combat scenarios. And hell, what would take that to another level entirely would be subtle facial animations that would trigger when your character activates VoIP. So not only could you hear the person talking in front of you or behind you, but you could see their face moving, making it clear if there's two friendlies close to each other who is actually talking to you. Hell, if your ears just got blown up by an explosion and all you hear is ringing, you can at least see that someone is looking at you and talking to you. Now again, I understand that so many people love the current methods, or lack thereof, of communication with teammates, usually via Discord, and even think that it's a purposeful and skill-based element of the game. All I can say is that personally, it seems to me to be far less immersive and realistic when you're unable to recognize your friends and have to constantly ask, is that you? Wiggle, 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 is that you? Than having a short delay after spotting someone before automatically being able to discern friend or foe in an unobtrusive and intuitive way. I guess I still fail to understand how some folks can be against an idea like this while simultaneously being okay with a handful of the other abstract features that I outlined earlier. Now, inevitably, whenever I mention VoIP, the conversation always devolves into people complaining that it'll ruin the game. I've actually had multiple pages written explaining how this idea is entirely nonsensical, but honestly, I'm going to spare you guys the details. The slider to control the volume of VoIP has been in the game for longer than most of you have been playing the game, so I highly doubt they're going to introduce the feature without the ability to turn it off. That being said, if you don't like it, turn it off. End of argument. Given the nature of Tarkov, the fact that there's some amount of stakes on the line, and diminishing returns on doing things like stream sniping the same streamer over and over again, I highly doubt we're going to be running into Wadu or Banana Man every other raid. Now, I'm sure that after it's introduced, it's probably going to be kind of wild for a little bit, who knows, but I'd imagine over time you'd end up with more experiences like this.
Fuck! Hey, shoot that motherfucker! Hey, fuck you!
And personally, I'm all for that. There's so many reasons why I think adding VoIP is not only going to be good for the game, but it's actually going to be vital to its success and longevity. Think about the future karma system. Now, the current default behavior of instant scav-on-scav violence, the existing special exfils that are on the maps that require a PMC and scav to team up to use, without proximity-based VoIP that hopefully doesn't require something like radios or getting up close to somebody and hitting a button to enable, those features make almost no sense and those problems will never go away. Imagine how dynamic raids would be. Imagine the endgame that could be created. Rather than level 70 chads just roaming around picking on level 4s all day, I'd be willing to bet that lots of them would now have a new way to have fun, using VoIP to take newbies under their wing, helping them quest in raids, make friends, and creating a ton of crazy memories. Sure, there's a chance for betrayal, but that exists today. Imagine all that can come from this one simple feature, though. Imagine a karma system that was based on multiple dimensions. You could choose to stick to your faction, killing all USEC if you're a bear and trying to only team up with other bears. With a little cleverness, you can turn it into a full-blown trust or reputation system. Imagine using VoIP in-game to disarm a potential fight with another player, decide that you want to partner up and help each other out. Once you think you can trust them, you can pair up and initiate the team-up prompt, which could link the two of you as a team. Now, just like today, it would show the name of the player you were offering to team up with, and maybe it also showed their karma score. Like a fucking eBay trader number, this would give you an idea of how trustworthy they are, and you can decide at any point if you want to betray them, but it would come at a cost. Maybe if after you team up, if both of you make it out of the raid alive, you get a healthy XP boost, maybe even a small reward. Now, if either of you finished a quest, maybe both of you will get a chunk of extra XP from that quest, and your karma will go up depending on how you were able to help each other during the raid. At certain high karma levels, you could unlock new quest lines, trader discounts, and more. Now, maybe if your teammate dies, you'll lose any of the potential additional XP or rewards, but you won't lose karma, unless, of course, you killed someone who you were partied with, which should, in my opinion, cause a steep decline in your karma, leading to things like more expensive trader prices, having a chance to be tagged and cursed at the beginning of raids until you work your way back up the karma ladder. Hell, maybe there's some risk-benefit to having low karma, perhaps some hardcore quest line or evil perks like better perception at night or move much more quietly, almost like the cultists. The addition of VoIP in a karma system, even without teammate indicators that I talked about before, literally opens up Tarkov to an endless supply of replayability. You could spend one wipe doing a benevolent high karma run-through, and then if you get bored, you could reset your account and go for a middle-of-the-line normal build, and maybe next time a wipe hits, you could spice it up and do a hardcore, evil, low karma build for the added risk and reward. The different kinds of interactions, in-raid chirping, hilarious trash-talking, strategies and deception, the possibilities are endless. It's a serious game changer and would really highlight the potential of the game. Anybody that's opposed to VoIP because they're worried about their immersion, I have one thing to say to you.
Tired of this,
Fuck off!
Hey, I need a gun.
Hold
gun.
it! Fuck. Go, go, go! What the hell is wrong with you?
Now, lots more can be said about a handful of other related features present in Tarkov. The compass, hand signals, voice comms, the choices of faces, outfits, armbands, wiggling to communicate, aim punch, tunnel vision, the ringing of your ears, hand tremors, the list goes on. Each of these could probably be their own video, but for now, I'll spare you. Now, all I ask from you is that you keep these ideas in mind the next time the topic of Tarkov Realism comes up. Consider my position that when it comes to the design of specific features, realism is irrelevant. What's relevant is how the design is able to immerse the player, how successful it is at abstracting the intended experience, making the interaction accessible, natural, and intuitive. These subtleties and distinctions are so important not only to the immersive nature of the game, but also the strategic nature of the game as well. They add so many more elements to combat, more options for you to consider, more tools for you to utilize in the heat of battle. They add to the depth of the game, more richly reward player skill and ingenuity, and have the potential to really set the game apart even more from any other games out there. I fear that our continued failing as a community to understand these important distinctions will forever relegate the phrase "getting Tarkoved" to be a derogatory term for being fucked by flaws in a game. I long for the day that the phrase "getting Tarkoved" is synonymous with going down honorably in the line of duty to a skilled and smart enemy at the end of a prolonged, intensely fought, badass firefight. This is what getting Tarkoved means right now. This is what Tarkov can and hopefully will mean in the future. Thanks for watching.